So when I was about 19 years old, I was still living with my parents, going to college. My parents, being the saints that they are, used to get up on Saturday mornings and go feed the homeless routinely under the bridge here in San Antonio. And me being a 19-year-old who didn't have his priorities right, I would say pretty routinely that I was going to wake up and join them, and then fail to do so. And then on Saturday mornings, I would wake up, go straight to the kitchen, usually, and fix myself a bowl of cereal or something. So this was a routine Saturday morning. And I'm getting up to do that. The house is quiet, as it typically would be. And then when I'm at the refrigerator, before I open it, I see in the corner of my eye, my peripheral vision, a short black female. My mom's black, as I am. So I see what appears to be a short black female, short black woman, I would take it as, who else would be in my house, over to my right. Anybody who's seen me in person, and you might be able to notice some of this through the camera, I speak with my hands, I always have, even back then. And so I gesture toward her. I look to my right, and I gesture toward her, like, oh, you're here. And I'm in the midst of saying, essentially that, oh, you're here. I thought you would be gone already. And as I gesture to the right and move my hand toward her, I don't see my mother. And I don't see, like, a shadow that I mistook for something else, or a coat rack, or anything else that you kind of see cliched as the source of the hallucination for what was presumed to be something else. I see, full-bodied apparition, basically, a little black girl in a blue dress, pigtails. She's there for, I don't know, an instant, split second. I don't know how you measure that amount of time that's just there, and then in a blink, it's gone. It was that fast. But she was definitely there, long enough for me to get a full concept of who this was, or what I was seeing at least. I didn't know who it was. This was some strange little girl in my house, and then just disappeared. And it, again, wasn't like she disappeared, but there was something I realized that was casting this image effectively, something that I had mistaken for the shape of a little girl, when in fact it was a pile of clothes or whatever else. There was just nothing there. Floor, open space, gone. And I will never forget this, because I stood there frozen for several seconds with my hand outward, as I mentioned, gesturing toward the figure that I thought was my mother. And I just stood there, bewildered, for however long before I left the kitchen, went over into the living room, sat on the couch that we had at the time, and just started wondering about, what had I really just seen? Did I really just experience that? And what do I do next? Because there's not really a great answer for what just happened here. Best case scenario, or I don't know if this is best or worst case scenario, presuming seeing a ghost is the worst case scenario, then best case scenario, I just had a complete hallucination unlike anything I've ever experienced prior to that, and I've never experienced anything approximating that, not even close, since then. So what would be the reasoning for my brain to misfire, and the chemistry and the circuitry in my brain to just decide, I'm going to show you something that doesn't exist, first out of the corner of your eye, so much so that you start to talk to it, and then I'm going to show it to you in its entirety when you're staring directly at it, just for long enough for you to recognize what it is that you're seeing and be freaked out about it, and then it's gone, and then never have anything like this happen to you again. And I'm speaking about this as if my brain sabotaged me on purpose, like my brain decided it was going to screw with my consciousness, as if those are two different things, and that gets into an entirely different, I guess, discussion. But you see where I'm going with this. What I've described to you, or what I consider to be, well, what I described to you is a story that I've told to some of my other colleagues and some other people in different environments before. If you listen to the Talking Scared podcast hosted by Neil McRobert, I've told that story on his 200th episode, where he was collecting scary, real happenings from all kinds of horror authors for a celebration of his 200th episode. If you've been in certain, if you're on the off chance that you've seen me speak live and in person at different events, I've told the story a couple of times there. So on one hand, that is what I've described to you. On the other hand, what I think I've also described accounts for what I would say are the first probably 2 stages of what I'm calling we all know about, or probably we all know about, the 5 stages of grief. And without getting too detailed into this, and I'm certainly not a professional in terms of being qualified to break this down in any kind of exceptional detail, but the 5 stages of grief, to my understanding, are not concrete rules. This is a general concept, but it's not adamant that everybody goes through this, obviously. And it's going to depend on your background, culture, the exact circumstances of the grief that you're experiencing. To quote Kendrick Lamar, I grieve different. That applies to a lot of different people, even if you're all from the same background and walk of life, much less if you're brought up in certain conditions and environments through the thousands of years of human history that are going to have you process grief differently, because that's just the culture that you're brought up around and the specific situations and circumstances that are going to dictate how you respond to grief. If you're a soldier in ancient times, I don't know how much denial maybe you'd be in about seeing someone on your side perish in battle. That would probably be very expected to various degrees, versus modern times where you might experience grief and go through all of the stages before you finally hit acceptance, and then you've stopped along the way at anger and bargaining and despair and all of the above. To kind of match that, just for the purposes of something a little bit lighter and more fun, but still I find very interesting, I decided to create my own 5 stages of seeing a ghost that, again, would not necessarily apply to every culture and every scenario, depending on how you grew up, what your belief system is, and how you think about the afterlife and what it would mean if you spoke to spirits, as opposed to people who are non-believers or people who have been brought up in an environment, like so many of us have, to think that seeing a ghost would be probably one of the most terrifying things that could happen to you. And when I started thinking about this concept of 5 stages of seeing a ghost as it applies to the way that I reacted, it occurred to me that there's a sequence, a pretty short sequence that I'm going to be able to share here from a television film, the BBC 1968 adaptation of the classic ghost story, Oh Whistle and I'll Come to You, My Lad. The BBC adaptation title is just Whistle and I'll Come to You, and it stars Michael Horton, who is was a R.I.P., prolific English actor who I knew primarily before I'd seen this film from the 1951 adaptation of Scrooge, where Alistair Sim plays Scrooge, and then Mr. Horton plays one of the most famous fictional ghosts of all time, Jacob Marley, and plays him incredibly well. That's my favorite adaptation of A Christmas Carol, primarily because it maintains a lot of the spookiness while also at the same time maintaining the hopeful atmosphere of this Christmas story, and it blends both of these elements pretty perfectly. But when it gets to the ghosts, it actually feels a little bit eerie, and also includes some despair and stages of grief within that story as well. That's an entirely different discussion, though. One of these days broach the subject of what I call heartbreak horror, but I took that phrase from Will Erickson of Too Much Horror blog, the Too Much Horror blog. Shout out to Will Erickson for coining that phrase. Getting back to this film adaptation of Whistle and I'll Come to You. In the climactic scene, we see the main character, played by Michael Horton, finally confront a ghost in an undeniable way. He can't dismiss this as a dream, as he has with other incidents earlier in the story. Well, to be fair, he's dismissing it as a dream because it is a dream, but it's a dream that's a portent of things potentially to come. And I would strongly encourage you to go watch this movie in all of the available places, because it's a film about a certain kind of inevitability that is going to catch up to someone exhibiting a certain amount of hubris. Having said that, here's the scene in question. And I'm going to talk through the moments where he is exhibiting what I think are the 5 stages of seeing a ghost, which I'm going to call fear, confusion, doubt, rationalization, and then finally, denial. It starts with fear for him, to the extent that he's actually sucking his thumb. And through that thumb sucking, he's starting to say the words that he's going to repeat throughout the rest of this sequence. Oh no. But he's high-pitched. Well, first he's not even high-pitched really. I mean, kind of squealing through it, but his thumb's in his mouth. He can barely even kind of mumble out the phrase before somebody comes into the room and tries to assuage him of the panic that he is feeling, because this sheet has risen in the unoccupied bed that is also in the room that he's in at this inn, and he's telling himself, oh no, almost not even realizing that somebody else has entered the room with him, it seems. And he's obviously terrified. This is the fear stage. I've seen a ghost. I am seeing a ghost. And or I've just seen a ghost. That really happened. And that is something so outside of the range of what we expect to happen in our ordinary lives that what else could you feel but absolute terror if you're somebody, again, brought up in a culture where this is unexpected, or you don't have previous experience with seeing a ghost. The next phase, confusion. As he's led away from what he's seen, and he takes a seat back in his bed, he continues to say, oh no, repeatedly.
Oh no.
Yeah,
Oh no.
I think I'll.
Oh no.
I'll.
Oh no.
This
Oh no.
It's very clear on his face that there's bewilderment. Originally I was going to call this phase bewilderment, but I feel like that's just kind of a mouthful. It's not a huge $1 million word or anything, but it's a little bit of a clumsy word for kind of identifying something as a stage of an experience, right? So for this stage of seeing a ghost, he has entered what we'll just call confusion, even though a more powerful word, I'll get that right, a more powerful word might be more apropos. But he is very confused, clearly, and he is at a loss for anything else to say other than repeating, oh no. And even as he kind of gathers a modicum of composure, he takes a breath, kind of swallows a little, enough to clear out his throat and no longer have this high-pitched version of oh no coming out of his mouth. And it's a little bit more stabilized and controlled when he says it again, as he shakes his head, but he still doesn't sound confident yet. And this is the doubt phase.
Oh no. Oh no.
I went from I'm seeing a ghost and I'm terrified to I'm confused about what I just saw because this isn't supposed to happen. How could I have seen a ghost? They're not supposed to exist. And then as he says, oh no, again, now more controlled, not quite confident, but he's entering this stage of, did I really see what I thought I saw? And then he takes another beat, another little breath, and now, more confidently, almost asserts, almost, but not quite yet, oh no, I couldn't have seen that. Because ghosts aren't real. And he is now entering phase 4, which I would call rationalization.
Oh no. Oh no.
You start to try to make sense of this and regain your grasp of reality and understanding of the way things are supposed to be. It could be just as simple as ghosts aren't supposed to exist, so I couldn't have seen that. And then the final thing he says, the final line of the film, the freeze frame image right before we get to credits, is him just shutting his eyes and saying, no.
No.
No more oh no, which has a little bit of uncertainty still attached to it. Now it's just no. He is in the denial phase of seeing a ghost. Now again, this is going to vary from person to person depending on your background and your relationship with the concept of ghosts. I'll tell you about my experience first before I tell you about things I've heard from other people. To continue with my experience, I explained earlier on how I went through my fear phase. It wasn't quite as pronounced as it was in the film here. I wasn't sucking my thumb or anything, but I was frozen with fear. And then I was temporarily frozen with confusion before carrying that confusion over to the couch where I sat down. And while I was on the couch, I entered my doubt phase. Did I really see what I thought I saw? How is that even possible? My version of rationalization was shaped a little bit differently. I held on to this experience for, I think, if I'm remembering correctly, about a day and a half or so. It's been a while. It's been some 20 some odd years since I was 19 years old. I mean, closer to 30 years than 20 at this point. So I held on to it, as I recall, for about a day and a half. And then I actually asked my mother, because she had been the primary person involved with the actual purchase of the house at the time, because my father was overseas in the military. So she'd been the one to speak to the previous owners of the house, who were the sellers. She would know more about the history of the house, at least as I believed at the time. I asked her, had a little black girl, to her knowledge, ever lived here? What was the race of the family that lived here previously? She told me they were a white couple, to her knowledge. They didn't have any, adopted little black girls or anything that were children in the house or anything like that. And immediately upon hearing that no little black girl lived in the house, part of me just said, okay, well, if that's the case, that couldn't have been a real ghost, because my rationalization for it was that there are rules, as I understand them, of what a ghost, what a haunting is supposed to be. And a haunting is supposed to consist of somebody who once lived in a place, or maybe was buried in that place, if you believe in ghosts existing in graveyards. Either it's their body, their presence, something tethered to that place. This is where they were murdered. This is where they lived. This is where they were buried. Something substantial tethers them. And if this little girl never lived in this house, I doubt there was ever, an unsolved murder, it seemed, in this house. If there was one, I wasn't about to go asking questions about it, because that's how people get caught up in supernatural, crazy scenarios, and you end up getting dragged to hell or something like that. So I wasn't wanting to get involved in anything like that, but I doubt if there had been like some unsolved murder or other untimely death related to this little girl in this house. Her body probably wouldn't have been buried there if she had never lived there. There's no reason to think that. So I just immediately took that as my reasoning, my rationalization, to dismiss what I had seen. And that allowed me to bridge the gap between rationalization, between really doubt and denial, that rationalization. And so I bridged it, and I entered where I still am, I guess to some degree, or to a large degree, to this day, in the denial phase. Every time I've told this story to somebody, and they say, what do you think happened? I say, as I mentioned earlier, I think my brain basically just misfired. For whatever reason, I hallucinated something that wasn't there. Our brains are complicated. I'm certainly not qualified, again, to explain why hallucinations happen, why this specific type of hallucination would happen so vividly this one time in my life, and nothing ever like it again ever occurred. I don't have any answers for that any more than I would be able to answer the idea of why a little girl would be haunting this house if, to my knowledge, to my mother's knowledge, to the amount of knowledge that I was willing to gain on the subject at the time, and I guess into the present, why this specter would be there when the rules, which are arbitrary, who's to say that a ghost can't travel to other places? We're to say it based on this thing that we have either invented or don't understand at all. But we've decided, primarily, that ghosts inhabit places where something substantial happened to them, as I mentioned earlier. And if that is not the case here, then why would this specter exist here? Since I can't answer that question any better than I can answer the question of why my brain would do this, I just lean toward the accepted scientific, something closer to the scientific truth of things, which would be that ghosts aren't real. And I probably just had something go wrong in my brain for no reason, because it's a mysterious, strange organ, and saw something that wasn't there and went on about my life. When I've told people who are believers in ghosts of that story, they're all telling me, they've all told me that I'm just in denial. And especially when I get to that part, obviously, at the end. And even when I told Neil, as I mentioned on his podcast, Neil, who is an ardent, beyond, I would say, skeptic, I think skeptic, in a way is kind of like dancing around the concept of just, I don't believe, and I have reason not to believe, because again, the science of things in the material world tells us that this doesn't exist. So even he, however, when I told him the story, I can't really provide any better explanation than I just think that my brain misfired, and he kind of pushed me on, like, well, why do you think that, and what do you really think? And I couldn't say anything better than what I had already explained. He kind of expressed his own doubt in my denial. It was an interesting kind of space to be in, and interesting to hear that from him, because he didn't outright dismiss it, obviously, and he basically believes the same thing that I would believe, which is that I must not have seen a ghost. I can't explain what I did see exactly, or why I hallucinated this, but it couldn't have been a ghost, right? He would obviously believe that because he's a non-believer in ghosts, but it was interesting to hear him nonetheless express doubt that he thought that I was really disbelieving it, and kind of, in a manner of speaking, appreciate the fact that this is my experience, and it's so bizarre. And if you listen to his whole episode, it's fascinating to, that whole episode of Talking Scared, I think is really fascinating. Definitely listen to it, because there are other horror authors expressing other supernatural potential circumstances. I tell a different story on there as well from somebody else. I took their story because it's one of the most bizarre things I'd ever heard of. But you hear other people with their personal experiences, and Neil is really open to hearing about these things, even if he's a non-believer. And it, to a certain extent, made me think of a quote. I'm not going to get the quote exactly right. Apologize for that. But a statement that I'm going to misquote a little bit, but get the sentiment right, from Sapphire Sandalo. Shout out to Sapphire, who the creator of the Something Scary, very popular YouTube series for a time, and now is making her own film and doing wonderful things. She's done paranormal investigation TV episodes, and she does her own podcast where she talks about all kind of paranormal activity. It's just super engaging, entertaining, open-minded stuff. And Sapphire once said something to the effect of, it's not about whether you believe in ghosts. When you hear stories like this, sometimes it's not about whether you believe in ghosts. It's about whether you believe in people. In a way of speaking, basically saying, I don't necessarily have to believe that you saw this, but I'm going to believe your version of events, that you experienced it to some extent. And I wasn't there, so I can't tell you what you did or didn't see. And I feel like Neil was giving me that much leeway, but it was interesting because he was also giving it to me in a way that encouraged me not to be in denial about it. And again, that's the stage that I still feel like I rest in. is in not wanting to commit to the idea that I must have seen something supernatural. I probably just hallucinated something, I guess, but I don't know why I would have done it again, and I feel like I'm entering like doth protest too much territory, which I don't really like using that quote because it's not exactly the way you should be using it based on the play, but I don't want to get all into that sidetrack. But that's the way I sound right now. I know I've gone on for too long about that. One thing I do want to talk about before I close out this video is the idea, again, that not everybody enters these stages when it comes to the concept of seeing a ghost. These are my 5 stages of seeing a ghost, as I think a lot of people would experience them, and also as perfectly illustrated. I just couldn't resist creating this when I thought of "Oh, Whistle and I'll Come to You," that adaptation, and how it's perfectly captured by this character just repeating the words "oh no" and then finally "no" over and over in that scene. Just brilliant stuff. But not everybody's going to engage with the supernatural potentially that way if you were to see a ghost. And I kind of keep that sort of thing in mind when I'm writing fiction, when I'm writing about how are you encountering, how would a character who encounters a ghost react to that? Do they go through my 5 stages, or because of their background would I need to tweak some things? So I've talked to people who would not obviously go into the denial phase because they are believers in the supernatural and in ghosts, and so they would not enter denial unless there was some reason for them to think that on this one occasion they were not they actually did just experience something that can be explained otherwise for whatever reason on this particular occasion. There are going to be people who don't enter the denial phase. There are going to be people who jump to denial like basically right away. You might not experience fear, confusion, anything. Just see something strange, corner your eye, what have you, and just that couldn't have been there. Don't know what it was. I'm not bothering with it. There might be people who just kind of get locked into fear and confusion and then go into phases that I didn't even put down as concrete, but I know would exist. It's just gonna depend on, again, who you are, and I think this would just be more uncommon for the general population as opposed to the ones that I've asserted are the 5 stages of seeing a ghost. But obviously it's going to vary from person to person, as I've mentioned. But I think curiosity, even obsession, could end up being stages of seeing a ghost. And I wrote a short story that's in my upcoming collection titled Midnight Somewhere. Get Midnight Somewhere coming out in December. And then if you want to, by the way, pick up my novel coming out in February, my 3rd novel, Dead First, through Penguin Putnam. In Midnight Somewhere, I wrote a short story titled Every Time You Look Away. And it's about a young man who gets himself caught up in a supernatural situation because of his obsession with having seen a ghost. He experiences a haunting that we learn about as he's suffering through the current haunting. He's experienced a previous one. And his obsession with needing to see a ghost again is actually overriding any kind of self-preservation, any thoughts of maybe I'm pushing this too far that he has, because he needs to experience it again. I actually took a little bit of inspiration whenever I created that concept of his obsession and curiosity from this conversation I had with a guy I met in Minneapolis with my old job back in the day when I was traveling to Minneapolis, and he was from San Diego, but now he's living in Minneapolis, but he still went and surfed. He just had to go surf on the Great Lakes because he was just passionate about surfing. So much so that apparently to surf the really good waves, I guess, that he was trying to catch on the Great Lakes, he had to wait sometimes for storms to either come in or they had just swept through. I forget the exact detail, but basically these storms that would hit the lakes, winter storms even, and go out there when the waves have been kicked up. And you can go online and look, there are different people who do this still that are fishing in the midst of the ice because they just love surfing that much. And I asked him, how does it feel then? If it's that passionate to you for you to actually go out into the water when the water is that cold. What is this like? And he said basically that every time, for him, the experience was, every time he caught a wave, it was over so fast, but so exhilarating, that all he could think about doing was going right out to catch another wave to try to verify that what he just experienced really happened. It was almost like he could never latch on to that sensation. And now he's stuck in a sort of loop of chasing this exhilaration, this thrill, that he can never concretely really confirm. He's always feeling like, did that really occur? I need to experience it again. And so I applied that kind of level of curiosity combined with obsession and made that one of the stages of this experience of seeing a ghost for my character in my short story, one of the short stories in Midnight Somewhere. And it leads him into a dangerous situation, and I don't think it's much of a spoiler to say, a horrible fate. I am a horror writer. I don't wish anybody else a horrible fate, however, whenever you're out there in the world and if you happen to run into a ghost. I hope that, the phases of the stages of seeing a ghost that you might experience are maybe a little bit more enriching even and uplifting. It should be kind of a marvelous experience in a way. You're getting confirmation of the afterlife, but maybe there is something sinister and horrible about the idea of not having peace and remaining on Earth and kind of lingering and suffering, and none of the living can see you anymore, and time is passing and you can't really even tell the passage of time maybe from where you are right now. Who knows? There are all kinds of wild ideas about what could be involved with the experience of being a ghost, and maybe that's what's at the core of us being afraid of seeing a ghost, not wanting to be an invisible body that rises as a sheet in somebody's bedroom in order to be seen, for instance, as was the case in A Whistle and I'll Come to You. There's just a lot of different potential avenues to explore there, and I'm just throwing out my take on the concept. If you enjoyed the video, I guess I'm supposed to say hit like and subscribe. That's what everybody does on these things. Do you need the reminder? I guess you kind of do sometimes when I'm watching videos. Somebody reminds me and I'm like, oh snap, I guess I did forget to hit the like button. So obviously that helps if you enjoyed the video. And again, I have 2 books coming up. One in December, Midnight Somewhere. The actual release date will be on the screen. I'm bad about remembering release dates. Midnight Somewhere, my first short story collection, coming in December, and then in February 10th, if I'm not mistaken, it'll be corrected on the screen if I am mistaken, Dead First, my 3rd novel, again through Penguin Putnam. Excited about that. Talk to you soon.